Good afternoon, everyone.
Oh yeah, I've been sharing it too. I guess there's different.
Raise your hand if you were just in the date labeling working group for lunch. Oh, you guys are hardcore date people. Raise your hand if you feel like you're just coming to this, you're coming to this session to kind of just learn about this date labeling thing that you've heard about. Okay, so a little mix. So just want to acknowledge that we do kind of have a little bit of a mix of experience with this topic in the room. So we'll just take a few minutes really to try to level set a little bit. And also recount a little bit of history as to like, recent history on this topic. We won't go all the way back, Emily, to the 70s or maybe. But you know, so for those of you who know this topic well, apologies for telling you things you know. But my name's Dana Gunders, and I am the moderator here for this panel. And I kind of came to this issue as I had sort of stumbled on numbers about how much food was being wasted out there, and I started researching it more and more. This topic of date labeling kept coming up, and it was coming up actually in the European context because that's really where people were working on this issue at the time. But I realized it actually was the same issue that was happening here, and I started looking into it and quickly kind of came across Emily and the work that was being done here at Harvard, and was myself very, very surprised to learn that these dates are not federally regulated. And oh my gosh, these dates actually are not telling you to throw food out. And I was so, I had spent kind of my life thinking that they were. So I actually wrote a blog before I ever wrote a big paper on food waste or anything. I wrote a blog that was called, oh gosh, it was like the myth of Best By dates or something like that. And the thing went crazy viral to my absolute shock. It was like my first time ever on Twitter, and all of a sudden, at the time you could track tweets, and this thing went viral, and hundreds of comments, and they all said the same thing. They said, "Thank you for saving my marriage. I have been telling my wife for 15 years that I can eat the yogurt, and now I can say I'm right." And I'm like literally every single comment was about this. But anyways, I think the reason that it went viral is that people really don't understand these dates. And the way they don't understand them is maybe a little bit different. And we sort of like lump all this into, we talk about date label confusion, and actually think you could parse that out, and maybe we'll do some of that here. But Emily and I went on to write a paper, which really is to say that Emily's students wrote most of a paper, and she and I published it together. And we got a huge response to that as well. We shared a hotel room in New York City and kind of traded off. She did CNN, I did NBC Nightly News, walking through the supermarket with the anchor, that kind of thing. But again, I think the reason the news was really interested in this is because they know that that they were surprised themselves, and they know other people are surprised when they read that, oh my gosh, these dates don't actually mean what some people think they do. There's different statistics on how many people are confused by these dates. Emily, in partnership with Center for a Livable Future, they actually conducted a study not too long ago and found that 84%.
Whoa.
Really should have done my homework here.
84% of people throw food away either always or most of the time at the date because they're afraid that it's unsafe.
That's right.
No matter what the date is.
Similarly, the Food Marketing Institute does an annual survey of the U.S. Grocery shopper trends, and the numbers have kind of like shifted a little bit over the years, but generally speaking, around it's similarly fine. I think it's around in the high 80%. People either frequently or always throw food out on the date because they're concerned about the food's safety. So here's the thing, right? There's sort of levels, there's different ways in which this is confusing for people. One is the fact that There's all sorts of different phrases out there. And I generally group dates into two buckets. Maybe there's a third. But the two buckets I group them into are sell-by dates, which are B2B dates, right? Those are the dates that manufacturers are using to tell their stores that are selling their product, this is when you should sell this product by. That's different from the other bucket of dates, which I would say are B2C dates, where it's the manufacturer telling the consumer, hey, consume this product by this date so that you can have the best experience with it. Or I'll stand by my brand, essentially until this date. And the sell-by date therefore, like in theory, builds in time for the consumer to get it home and then have a good experience with it, because it's just telling the store when to sell it by, and of course, the store needs to sell it with some time for the consumer to then get home and use it. So, one of the things that when we were writing our report, we came up with was, hey, let's get rid of these sell-by dates, because nobody is distinguishing between a sell-by date and a use-by date and a best-by date and a joy-by date and a delicious-by date. And so let's at least have them all be in the same bucket, right? Let's at least sort of have them all be intended for consumers to actually read. And let's make any sell-by information that businesses want to communicate to each other invisible. And code that, or make it somehow otherwise available to the store if you need to, but not look like what the consumer-facing dates should look like. The other recommendation that was sort of the salient one that came out of our report that has kind of galvanized some support behind it is to have basically, instead of having a million different phrases, to have two basic phrases. One where the manufacturer is intending for the date to really be about the quality of the product. Maybe it gets stale afterwards, maybe it gets crunchy or watery or whatever it is, but this is a quality date. You're gonna, you can eat it after if you're okay with the quality after, but just kind of don't judge me, brand A, right? The other type of date would be something that we, for shorthand, have called a safety date, because there are a few cases in which manufacturers are using those dates to try to tell consumers not to eat the product after. They actually don't want the consumers to consume that product after, and it's not a quality issue. It's because they've actually done some, risk assessment of food safety challenges, and they actually think that there's an increased risk to consuming that product after a date. The problem is right now, there are no definitions tied to any phrases, so you and I can't look at a product, and if it says, yogurt and it says use by, I don't know if that's meant to be a safety issue or it's meant to just be a quality issue. And so the umbrella recommendation that's out there right now is to have one date that is about quality, one date that's about safety, have those definitions to actual phrases, tied to like regulations or a standard system of some kind, so that we can all feel confident that when we see the words best if used by, and that is the recommended phrase that's out there for quality, that we know, okay, we can eat it after, it's no big deal. And if we see the words used by, that the manufacturer is actually recommending we don't eat that product after that date. And I should say that the number of products that tend to have safety issues really kind of tied to the date are very, very small right now. So the vast majority of products, we believe, would actually carry the quality date. So I wanted to kind of do that level setting. And since we met a couple years ago, I would say a bunch of exciting things have happened. And Emily is going to tell you about them.
Great. So I'm going to try to do a couple things.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't
Okay.
actually introduce you guys. So let me do that first.
Okay.
You've now heard from Emily several times. So Emily Leib, Director, Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic. Lee Anderson with General Mills and working on implementing their date label conversion there. And Jackie now
Suggit.
she just changed her name. Jackie was formerly, I got to know Jackie when she was at Walmart because she was busy trying to implement standardizing their date labels there. She has since joined the refed team and is helping on their date labeling effort with other companies at Refed. Okay, now we can go.
Okay. So I'm going to try to do a few things. The first is just give, picking up where Dana left off, highlights of in some ways there's been a lot of change actually in the last few years, just especially looking at when we first published the dating game. The first 3 years it was like crickets. Like we're like, consumer, people were talking about it, we were asked to present, the news was interested, but there wasn't anything really happening. I think by contrast, the last few years there's been a lot. So I want to talk about that, and then I want to talk a little bit about the policy side of this, and in particular the fact that there's still a lot of states that state law that gets in the way of implementing any voluntary standard. So I'll do that, and then these guys will talk, and then we'll kind of get all of your questions. But I also want to really quick, so I don't forget, put in a plug that we have a date label working group that met just before this, and we'll meet again tomorrow. So if you weren't in that, but you get really interested after this discussion and want to join us, there's plenty of room. I can talk you through what we're going to be focusing on. Okay, so just, again, from 2013 to like 2016, not that much actually happened, but there were a lot of conversations percolating. And then there were a few things at once. The Refed report, which really, said, found that standardizing date labels was the most cost-effective way to reduce food waste because it is low cost. Changing the labels on food, if you're already putting labels on, isn't a costly thing to do. Just swap out some words, and we can hear just what that looks like. Obviously it takes time, and it does. I don't want to say it's no cost, but it is low cost. And then Walmart implemented best if used by across all of their branded products, which is what Dana was referencing. And then also the Food Date Labeling Act was legislation introduced in both the House and Senate in 2016, and then reintroduced in the Senate this past year. The USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service, which oversees meat and poultry, recommended, that for all products that are being labeled for quality reasons, that they also use best if used by. So all of those things happen. And then the Grocery Manufacturers Association and Food Marketing Institute also came out with a voluntary standard, and we'll hear a little more about what it's looked like. And that was to have best if used by on all foods for a quality reason. So that's, again, the large majority of foods where that food either is something that, the date is really about taste, it's about freshness. They want you to eat it before that date because it's going to taste good, and they want you to like their product. If I were selling a product, I would want you to like my product. I'm selling a conference, and I'm hoping you're liking it. So exactly. So that is valid, but I think it's helpful for people to know that's what that means, that it might not taste as good after this date, but there's not, a reason you might get sick. And I think a lot of times that is also products that you're going to cook or prepare further. By contrast, the small number of foods where, things have more of a risk because either they're prepared in a grocery store or sometimes things like deli meats, things like that, that just you really should use before that date or close to that date. There can be more risk afterwards. And oftentimes it's because those things aren't going to be cooked. Most people aren't cooking their deli meat. I think we recommend for pregnant women that if you're going to eat deli meat, you cook it first. I don't know if anyone's following that. But so anyway, GMA FMI came out with this voluntary standard, and I think we're going to spend a lot of time really talking about that. And then also the Consumer Goods Forum, which is a group of 400 of the largest food and consumer goods companies globally recommended standardizing to that same language, which is best if used by for quality and used by for safety or discard. And we can talk a little bit about what that label means and how we define it. So that's been, I think, just really rewarding for myself, and I think for people working in this space, to see that there's so much investment, I think, of industry and of businesses to really come together, figure out phrasing that they could use, that they could agree on. And I know that was, a big issue too, was how are we going to get everyone to go from the 40 different labels to a couple things that people agree they can use. The problem with this is, as we're moving towards implementation of this voluntary initiative, there's this issue of state law that gets in the way. And so in our dating game report, I'd say one of the big findings was that most dates weren't used for a safety reason. The other big finding, I think that was shocking to a lot of people, was that the federal government wasn't at that time requiring any labels or any language, and in fact, at that time, wasn't actually even recommending the use of any consistent label. So USDA had guidance that said date labels can be used, such as, and there were like 4 possible labels. So I think people were surprised about that. But then because there has never been federal guidance, that 41 states were requiring date labels on a certain food product, and then 20 states are restricting sale or donation of food after that date. And it is such a mixed bag. I mean, there's clearly, often with state law, if there's a good law out there that everyone will say, this is a good law, let's follow this. But in this arena, there wasn't really like one model that everyone was following. It's like, in some states, milk has to have a date that's 17 days after it's pasteurized. In some states, it's 12 days after it's pasteurized. Some states require sell-by-owned milk, and some require use-by-owned milk. Some require 2 labels on it. A lot of states require, on eggs, both a pack date and a sell-by date, or a pack date and a use-by date. I mean, it's just crazy. So, and this, I think, has really posed a challenge as we, think about what it looks like to move into a world where we have just 2 standard labels on products. So we've been actually trying to look through, now that there is a proposed voluntary standard, and what we found is that about a little more than half of states will pose some problem for at least one food product with implementing the voluntary standard. So the most common, I would say, are milk, eggs, and shellfish. And again, there's still not like one way in which those, bar implementation of the standard label. And why this is important is, we were just in our working group session talking about how hard it's going to be to convey this information to consumers. So even once we get past the hurdle of having, most of industry or all of industry using the same labels, next hurdle is getting consumers to really get what those mean and actually take the moment to read the words and not just look at the date and then make that decision about what those words mean. And I think the more that there are certain foods that still are using a different date and not these standard ones, the longer it's going to take us to actually educate people, because they're still going to keep seeing different wording and different language on products. So that's something that concerns me about the states. I'd say the other big thing is there are still a lot of states that prohibit sale of food past a date that would be a quality date based on that food. So most notably, a lot of states require or ban the sale or donation of milk or dairy products after the date. And I think this is a product where, and I think, everyone has their own experiences with milk, but we did make a film a few years ago where I had my students taste milk that was past the date, as well as milk that we'd left out of the refrigerator for 1 day or 2 days. And there's no safety risk. Some of the milk didn't taste good. I couldn't notice any difference. I also had a cold, so who knows? But everyone was safe and happy. There might have been a few that we thought, oh, that didn't taste that good. But I think that there is really this misconception with certain foods that there's a safety risk. And while states are still requiring that food essentially be thrown out instead of sold or donated, it's really not getting to the spirit of the whole point of having these standard labels. So I think that's going to be a lot of work still. So the other thing I just want to briefly talk about is what has been proposed in terms of federal legislation, and then I'm not going to go into so much detail, but we can kind of come back if people are interested. I mentioned the Food Date Labeling Act had been introduced, so I'm going to tell you what that did, because some people have seen that, and then I'm going to talk briefly about some possible changes to that are under consideration, and really just to put it in front of people, because I think now is a time as well, if people have feedback or ideas or thoughts, that we want to hear those, and we can also fold some of that into the date label working group tomorrow. So the federal legislation, the idea I think would really be to enshrine the voluntary guidance. So industry has said, these are the 2 labels that we like. We're already moving towards implementation, and we'll hear more. I've heard that Lee has been deputized to speak on behalf of the industry. so he could speak not only from General Mills, but more broadly about some of the updates on that. But, so there's a lot of people moving in that direction. Let's keep the tailwinds with that and not go in a different direction. But what's the quickest way that we can get rid of some of these state laws that really are posing a challenge to that? So the idea, the Food Date Labeling Act would have, the dates would be best if used by for quality. It would be optional, so there might be some foods where people say, we don't think this food really needs a label. So I always think about like bottled water. Why does bottled water have a date? I'm not sure what the date is telling me on bottled water. It's water, or, vinegar, things like that. There's certain products I think that, arguably don't really need a date, but if you wanted to put a date on them, you would have to use this standard quality, best if used by language. And then the Food Date Labeling Act would have then said for foods that are labeled for a safety reason that the label would be used by, and that FDA and USDA would actually create a list of the foods that should have that label. And I think the idea there was that in across Europe, which has these a slightly different language, but the same concept of two standard labels. If you go into stores and you pick any given product, sometimes it's carrying the quality label and sometimes the safety label. So is there a way to make sure we don't have two labels, but still have them used in different ways on different food products? It would ban states from prohibiting the sale or donation of food past the quality date. So this, again, is if the spirit of this, if part of the point of this is to not waste food that is when it's just a quality date, then let's not have states banning sale or donation of those foods. And then it would require FDA and USDA to provide education. Again, to my point about just changing the labels is not going to have an impact unless people know what they mean and are educated. So that's what's in that language. Just the updates that have been considered, and I think I would love feedback now throughout the conference or in our working group, would be to have the safety date instead be called a discard date. And I think this gets to a point which is arguable. Like, what does it? There's still not a date after which something becomes unsafe. It's just that it's foods that might be more likely slightly to be unsafe after the date than others. So changing the language to be a discard date, and then having both of those be optional. So rather than having a list of foods that would be required to have that date, basically saying to companies, you pick which date goes on your food product, but you can't use anything on any food product besides these two language. Best if used by if you're using it for a quality reason, or used by if you're using it to indicate that it should be discarded. So it would, I think, certainly take less pressure off of the federal government, although they still would have a role to play in this proposed legislation on doing education, put a lot more on industry, which in some ways is great because they're doing this already. So, let's not get in the way of things that they may already be implementing, but still kind of gets us to a place that's a lot better than where we are now. And I'll say the one last thing, which is just in the meantime, there's a lot of states. I think by my count, there are 5 states in the last legislative session that are considering, actually 6, that have been considering date label law at the state level. So this is still ongoing. Some of them, I would argue, are good. California passed legislation that would allow use of the two standard labels, which is great. Some states have been proposing things that still are counterproductive. So we actually wrote a letter last year with Phil Abundance, and I see Glenn Bergman in the back, to a state rep in Pennsylvania that introduced legislation that would have required dates on every food and not allowed any food to be sold or donated after the date, which of course is counter to everything we're trying to do. We wrote a nice letter. We didn't hear back, but the legislation didn't move forward, so I'll call that a success. So, so I know that was a lot, but just like, where we are in terms of the policy piece. And then I think pass it back to Dana to take us forward.
Right, thank you. Emily? Jackie. Jackie's been working with ReFed. ReFed, she's going to tell you more. ReFed put a working group together, actually out of this conference last time, to work on clarifying which products should carry which label. And a decision tree, the ultimate product was a decision tree to help companies decide that, which if that new law gets written the way it will, I'm not exactly sure where it'll fall, but.
Yeah. Thanks, Dana. And let me just start with perhaps a little bit of context of date labeling in the total conversation of food waste that we're talking about at this conference. So as part of the roadmap that ReFed published a couple of years ago, there's a few different factors as far as how we can prioritize the different food waste solutions that are there. But one of those is economic value. And so if we look at economic value, the number one solution of those 27 is standardizing date labels. So the justification for the work is there, and I think the incentive for us to be focusing on this and why we're having a discussion and seeing so much much action in the last 2 years, it was a really great sign for the impacts that it can have on food waste. So to build on the story that Dana and Emily have already started, and thank you so much for the historical context, I think that brings us up to speed. Dana mentioned this, but as a part of that process and that story that they outlined, ReFed had a working group that had over 40 individuals across sectors and across the supply chain that came together to start discussing this issue in the early days and contributed to the development of the voluntary standard that was referenced, and then also developed what Dana just referenced, a date labeling standardization tool. And what this tool does essentially is it's meant to aid companies in deciding which of these two labels, the quality label or the discard label, should go on which products. So if I were to summarize this kind of flow chart model for you, simply, it basically comes down to 3 factors. The first is around refrigeration. Does the product require refrigeration either for food safety reasons or for spoilage prevention reasons? If it doesn't, it gets a quality label. If it does, it goes to the next step. The next step is ready to eat. The question here being, is there a kill step involved in the food? Are you baking it? Are you cooking it? Is there something that could be killing any potential pathogens that are in the food? So if it is ready to eat, then it goes on to the third step, which is there just an inherent risk of pathogen by the nature of the food product that it is? So if you answer yes to all these questions, that only at that point do you get a discard label. So I wrote down a few examples. It's not a very long list, but I wrote down a few examples of what those products are. And it would be things like pâtés and meat spreads, unpasteurized milk and soft cheese, smoked seafood, sushi, things like that. So these are broad categories that are just examples of working through that flow chart. And so if we think about what this tool does, ideally it's minimizing the number of products that are getting that discard date, and then as a result reducing the amount of food waste associated with products that are being discarded too early because of whether it's fear of a food safety concern or just a misunderstanding of what the date label actually means on the product. What the tool does not do, and some of the conversation that perhaps we haven't had yet, is it doesn't affect the actual date. So all the conversations we've been having, I think, have been focused on the verbiage itself, what precedes the date. And so that, I think, is just important context as we talk about policy in particular, just that that's really kind of where the conversation is now, is talking about that language. So the only other piece I kind of want to talk about quickly is as we see the voluntary guidance in place and a lot of companies taking action, which we're going to hear about in just a second from Lee, and as we see a lot of the data that's already come in, ReFed is now transitioning to supporting the implementation of standardization. How can we accelerate progress and then support the companies that are working on this every day? And I'd say the main areas that we're seeing that support needed, one, there's actually still an awareness issue in some cases. A lot of people are making progress and are making significant progress across brands and products, but there's actually some that still just need to know what to do or where to start, I would say, is the bigger question, is where do we start? And so whether that's gaining internal alignment, communicating with suppliers, a big area that I hope we'll focus on in both the working group and perhaps also in Q&A if there's more interest is measurement. Measuring both progress of what are the products that are implementing these labels, but also measuring impact. How can we show people the greenhouse gas emission reductions associated with standardization, which not only builds a business case, but I think also is really important for investment and innovation in the space. So that's a key area. Excited to hear Lee talk a little bit about the specifics of implementation. I would say just the one thing we're seeing is that there is a lot of momentum. For those that are struggling or who haven't started, I'd say the biggest challenges that I would highlight, like one I said is kind of that awareness and where to start. Another one is internal ownership. Is this a food safety issue? Is this a sustainability issue? Is this a government affairs issue? Like, where does this live? And so it truly is a collaborative topic across companies. You're going to talk more about that?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I'll stop there.
No, that's a good, I wasn't pointed, but that's a good catch. I'll talk about that.
So yeah, we'll hear more about that in a second. And then the final one that's already been touched on is regulation. So the challenges that rise between the conflict of state and currently the lack of federal regulation. And also, there were some benchmarks for implementation, and there's a lot of other things that are happening in labeling these days. So if you think about the nutrition fact panel and other things that companies were planning to kind of time this with, that can challenge and slow implementation in some cases. So that's what we're seeing. I'll actually stop there and let Lee kind of dive into some of the specifics from his on-the-ground experience.
Yeah, thanks, everyone, and I guess thanks Emily and Jackie, to Refed and the clinic for putting this together. General Mills is a proud supporter of Refed, and really happy to be here. So I, here on behalf of General Mills, just by way of background, one of the world's largest food companies. You probably know a lot of our brands, but specific to this topic, obviously a lot of packaged foods that are not perishable, so cereal, I'll use the brand names just to make it easy, so Cheerios and Wheaties and that type of thing, Nature Valley granola bars, but we're also in the perishable space, so Yoplait yogurt, we make refrigerated and frozen dough, Pillsbury, Totino's pizzas, so we've got some in the refrigerated and frozen space as well. And then as Emily mentioned, we're also a member of the Grocery Manufacturers Association, and I'm a member of the Grocery Manufacturers Association Sustainability Task Force, and got an update from them on the overall collaborative effort with the Food Marketing Institute. So Grocery Manufacturers Association is companies like ours that are producing food. Food Marketing Institute are the retailers, the grocery stores, Walmart, Kroger, Safeway, and the rest. So I can speak both about our effort at General Mills on date labeling standardization, and then I'll talk a little bit about the industry effort. So at General Mills, we are committed to the voluntary standard. It actually wasn't that hard for us. We were using better if used by. So to go to best if used by was just dropping a few letters. So we're committed to that standard. And we had previously been using better if used by and used by already. So it wasn't a huge shift for us. When your largest customer and the largest retailer in the world, Walmart, is already moving on that path, it makes it really easy for companies like ours to say, hey, that's a good idea. So we did, and we're in the process of it. So our progress is about 35%. We should be at 100% by the end of next calendar year. And actually, that's really tracking with the overall industry. So the industry numbers are about the same. We did a survey, GMA did a survey last November, almost the exact same numbers, projected compliance by the end of 2019. And there's a big reason for that. And that's because there are a number of regulatory changes on food labeling packages that are about to be implemented, the biggest of which is the new nutrition facts panel. So if you're not paying attention to this, all the nutrition facts panels on products in the U.S. will be changing, and that is required to be done by the end of next calendar year. So FDA has put out regulations. We're changing that. That's a really big change. And because a lot of, in particular, non-perishable products, their packaging doesn't get touched all the time in terms of changes, it's really a great time to be making a number of changes all at the same time so that you're not handling the product more than once. And that sounds like just a cost issue, but it's also it's a quality issue. The more we touch a package, the more risk that something could get changed incorrectly, even though we watch it really carefully. So we're really careful to try and make as many changes at once, put as many eyes on it, and do it right. So kind of a measure twice, cut once type of mentality. So that's very similar to most food manufacturers. So you're going to see a lot of packaging changes roll out over the next 18 months, not just from our company, but from a lot of companies. And that's when you're going to see the bulk of the compliance with the new date labeling standard. So that's really exciting. It got a little delayed. FDA had put a small delay on the implementation of the new nutrition facts panel, but now they finalized that and have made it clear that that will be done by the end of next calendar year. So we're really excited about that. As Emily mentioned, that is just a small piece of this. So after that is really the hard work, I think, of consumer education. And so we're committed to that in a couple of different ways. One is we already provide a lot of information to our consumers about what these labels mean when they call us. So we have a lot. I checked with our consumer contact center to get a sense of how many contacts we get. We don't get as many as I had expected. But we do get a number of calls. So I was reviewing, part of my role is I work with them on the responses that we provide. And I was reviewing the answers that we provide so that I had an understanding and appreciation of how much information we were providing to consumers. And I think we've got a good story and narrative there, but, we'll be looking to try and tie into other efforts to try and educate consumers. One of the challenges we have is with a lot of smaller packages, it's really hard to do that on the package itself, which would obviously be the best place to do it. We might have an opportunity with a package that has more real estate, like a cereal box, but think about a yogurt cup that's really small, so it's really hard to be able to say, smell the yogurt and see if it feels, which is one of the things they'll tell you is use your senses, right? So we're probably not going to have the opportunity to do that. But I think there's a lot of great opportunity for broader collaborative efforts to educate consumers about these things. And obviously Save the Food is a great program that is doing a lot of work that already. You had asked about kind of how we do this and how we work collaboratively. So at General Mills, we actually have a Food Waste Council internally. I sit on that. I'm one of the leaders of that. So it's a cross-functional group of government affairs, myself, our sustainability team, our quality and regulatory team that is leading the labeling implementation, but also has the science background on the food safety side, as well as our foundation, who is really invested in a lot of our food waste initiatives and supporting ReFed, for example. So we work collaboratively with a core team of leaders and then a broader team of internal stakeholders, meet monthly, check progress, and then work on a number of initiatives related to food waste. I could go on about all the different areas that we're touching, but specific to date labeling, that's where we get a regular report on our standardization progress, and so we're regularly reviewing it at that internal council. So that's a way that we work internally, cross-functionally. I've talked to some other peers. I think that's fairly similar. Sometimes it's just managed within the regulatory or the labeling group, and then you have to kind of go find the information, but everybody manages it a little bit differently. So I think that's it. The last thing I'd say is, even though we've got, the two largest groups representing the vast bulk of packaged goods and retailer private label, there still is kind of a whole wild west of perishable out there, I would say. And when you talk about the categories where there are these issues, milk, eggs, soft cheeses, if you think about where you buy those products and if you travel around the country, you recognize that there's a lot of manufacturers of those products, as opposed to like the cereal category, for example. There's 4 big players type of things. Lots of regional, lots of local. So that is really going to be an ongoing challenge, I think. And that was one thing that kind of stuck out when you were talking about that. So I'll end there.
Great, thank you. Well, I guess, just to tee off that, if the goal is to get everyone there and it's hard to get those regional players, one semi-obvious seeming solution would be federal legislation.
Sure.
So, how do you and sort of other counterparts at GMA and FMI, feel about federal legislation? Would it be helpful?
Yeah.
Too much regulation? What's the feeling there?
Yeah, I think it's a balance, right? So, we've said really clearly we support a national standard. I think that's part of the reason we were really invested in the voluntary standard and a collaborative standard between the largest industries that are really touching this space. We're always really sensitive to the really large manufacturers telling the small manufacturers what to do. There's a lot of tension, pushback on that. So we try not to, be prescriptive in that way. What we found is with a number of initiatives is once we all move, it just kind of happens. They hear from their retailers in particular, this is where we want you to move, this is where everyone else is, and then it just happens over time, and usually not a very long time. So I think because so many of us are going to be in full compliance by the end of next calendar year, I think things could happen really quickly after that. The other thing I'd say about national legislation is I think that the point that Emily raises on differing state standards is a really good one. So we really, I think that has to be part of any deal. is that we're making it really clear to the states what they can and can't do in this space. And that's not easy. I've worked in many of those discussions and talked to, state commissioners of agriculture. They're very protective of their enforcement authority. So that's not an easy discussion to have. That doesn't mean you don't have it. I'm just saying we have to be really aware of the types of conversations you need to have. But I think there's a lot of recognition that things maybe have gotten a little out of hand, and there's a real opportunity here. So, it's certainly a conversation that we're all watching very closely and participating in.
Can I ever have a reaction after you said?
Yeah, but I was actually going to
Please.
turn to you for a second as well, Emily. So I think one of the things that is in the bills that is hard to get at from a national standard, and Emily, this question is for you, is the fact that if you turn this into law, you then get to say, and we're not going to let states restrict sale or donation of products that are just a quality date. And I think that's one of the actually more powerful components of that law. So, Emily, my question is, if you didn't get federal legislation, are there other ways that we could get to allowing sale and donation of some of these products at those states, if there were, let's just say, a voluntary standard?
Yeah, I'll respond and I'll say I think I agree with a lot of what Lee said about just not only the challenges, but also I think the benefit of a federal law in this case, and this isn't always true, but the benefit would be to have standards nationally. And I could say a little bit like why I think it does make sense to kind of preempt state laws and have it be set at the federal level. So I think on the, maybe I'll do that, and then I'll just say quickly, if we don't do this, what we could do. Is that okay?
Yeah,
All right.
do it quickly. 'Cause
I will. So I'll say really quickly on, I think the benefits in this case are, when you ask consumers where they go to get information, so Lee mentioned they have a call line. Where do consumers go? Where do you think
Website.
they go? They go to a website, they look at the product's website, they go to the FDA and the USDA or whatever, federal government agencies, or they go to a state agency and try to get an answer for what am I supposed to do with this food after the date? Or they call me, and I'm sure you have this too now, Dana, like I get texts in the middle of the night that are like, can I eat mayonnaise? It's 2:00 in the morning, what are you eating? And like with your past date mayonnaise right now, I'm sleeping.
Oh my God, I'm totally going to do that.
So, and I happen to be up because I have a 4-month-old, and it's like, why are you asking me right now? But I think people like want to get answers, and I think one of the biggest things is the more that we are very clear at the federal level, I think it also allows FDA, USDA in particular, but other federal agencies to point to something and say, this is what this means. And I think even if we know 85, 90, 95% of foods are labeled in a certain way, I think it would be really hard for government agencies to say this is what this means unless it's also required that it mean that, because there could be the odd food that is, bearing the wrong label. There could be that deli meat out there that says best if used by because it's at a local corner store when it should be used by. So I think, if you think about where consumers are going to get that information, and I think this ties into the state piece too, which is we get a lot of questions from state and local agencies saying, people want to know about this, what information can I give them? And it's right now very difficult to say, here's what you should tell consumers, because there's still so much variation.
Yeah.
And again, it might get a little bit better, but it's so nuanced to say, well, if you're getting a product from a national label product, that is part of GMA or
Right,
FMI,
right.
then it means this. But if you're not, then it might mean that, or it might mean something else. I think there is opportunity to change these laws state by state. I think we've seen that there's a lot of interest by states. I think there's a lot of folks here at this conference that we've talked to that are looking at state laws and how to make those standard. And I think in the meantime, that's where we should be trying to go, is to try to make it so that any states that are willing to enshrine this voluntary standard. But I think there's also a lot of risk with that too. And we heard in the working group earlier from some folks saying, how do we label things properly if we're selling right now in multiple states and everyone wants something different? That's a huge barrier, I think, for especially small and regional companies. So,
Can I follow up on that? That's a good point, because the California legislation, which you described and, is on its face, we comply with, I still got questions internally about it and what does this mean, and how does this, how does this impact what we're doing, and should we change, and what's their timeline? And I was like, whoa, this is just, so when states act, when you're working on a national scale, it still poses the question, and it kind of impedes the process a little bit. So, we're plowing ahead, and, the states are gonna have to figure it out, but, this is the national standard, and we're all gonna be working on it, so.
Great, okay. I want to open it up to we have a quick hand by
Right
Allison.
away.
Allison there, she's ready to go, okay. Please, Allison.
How do you guys think about the real risk, the foods that should be used by and that do have, potential microbial contaminants, and the fact that the romaine lettuce outbreak, it was very rare to actually get sick relative to the amount that was out there, but our tolerance as a society is 0. So just in how these sort of recommendations are being put forth, where is that?
Jackie.
Yeah, I can start with that one. So I think it's a great question, and I think that in the development of the date label standardization tool was one of the goals, and the reasons we brought in food safety experts to think about if we were just to generalize by product category what's going to get what label, that's very challenging to do because there are some things you cannot control for. We can't control for what the consumer does with the product after they take it home. Is it staying in the car for an hour before they put it in their fridge? There's some factors you're never going to be able to control for. But how do we look at the products that, as a product itself, have an inherent risk or do not? Because I think if we get to the being overly conservative in what products are getting those labels, we're seeing a lot of increased food waste because consumers are throwing away based on that date. So there will always be a level of accountability in the supply chain for the transport, care, and storage of food. There will always be accountability on the consumer end. But we really were focusing, and this working group decided to focus on those 3 factors of refrigeration, ready to eat, and then just an inherent risk of pathogen to determine which products got that safety or discard label.
What I would say, I think your general point that food safety, our conservative nature around food safety creates a lot of waste is true. And it's a trade-off that we make as a society, and I think because food safety is very, very important, particularly to companies that, work with food and are rightfully extremely scared of the PR nightmare that happens when you do have a food safety issue. It just is a fact of our food system right now. That would be my thing. Other questions up there?
Aside from the call
Oh, yeah.
what other strategies are you using in order to communicate with consumers how long they have to eat the products or things like that? And what advice would you give to other members of the industry in terms of communicating that?
Yeah, the one I didn't mention but came up is our website, which is actually the bigger tool. Most people do go to our website, so we have, multiple touch points where you can find that information. So both on our individual product pages is typically information about use of the product. Then we have a general Ask Jenna Mills website. We have lots of date labeling information there as well. And then we're also starting to implement more and more tools on how to reduce food waste. So we have a number of brands that are really great at incorporating and you're able to use to reduce food waste. So think of our yogurt. You have a tub of yogurt. Here's ideas on how to use the whole tub. Oh, and by the way, here's an idea on how to reuse the tub itself. We're leaning into that even more and more. So I think our websites are really the best opportunity because that's where most people are going. They pick up their phone and they search for it. So that's where we're seeing most opportunity there.
Are you yet driving traffic to those sites though via social media things? Is that something that?
We have some brands that are, but not really specific to date labeling. It's more, we're starting some projects and we have some brands that have driven traffic related to here's how to use up all of this product. So brands like Mountain High Yogurt, Old El Paso, think of, or maybe Betty Crocker a little bit, are starting to say, here's ways that you can use up the rest of this product and drive traffic that way.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna take 3 questions and then like kind of just spit them out, try to be
There's one over
short-ish.
here.
And then we'll have them take them on at the time. Okay, so 1, 2,
I just want to say I've learned so much on at breakfast by reading the packaging.
There you go.
You know?
It's the best red real estate at the
I
table.
was wondering if you ever thought about putting something right on the box so kids could read it while they're having breakfast.
We've talked about it, I think it's something we'll continue to take a look at. I think especially as it continues to roll out and you're seeing more standardization, it's an opportunity to educate people. The reality though is most cereal does get eaten, all right away. It's very rare to have, oh, is this cereal still good? Because most people eat the whole box and then they buy a new one. So it's not the best product to kind of advertise it on. We've had that discussion too.
okay, sorry. Say your questions, 3 of them, and then we're gonna answer them. Okay.
So I'll just comment on that, but I have a whole bunch of different boxes of cereal, so they don't always get all.
Aha, there you go.
So it would be valuable,
But I like that you're buying a lot.
my question is, so I've heard you talk about the real need for consumers to be educated about date labels, which I'm still skeptical that people are still gonna look at a date and throw out. But how about, is there a strategy around, educating and speaking with, food, places that take donated food?
I was gonna talk about that.
Getting them to
Yeah.
accept it,
We
and
should
the
talk about
people
that.
they serve to accept.
Yes,
So wait,
things that are,
hold your hands up.
yeah.
a month or 2 past the.
Okay, so food
that's
donation
2 days past the
receiving
date.
agencies. Okay, got it. Yep.
In terms of the language used, I think you said, so best if used by, and there's a question on the ones where it's gonna be used by or discard by, the ones where there's really like pathogenic risk, is that right?
It's
No,
used by.
it would definitely be used by. The question is just how is it described as being a safety label or a discard label? And you heard us already on this panel use 2
Yes,
different terms, but it's definitely used by.
Okay.
where they're going,
Yes,
yeah.
so my next question that was, what's the consumer input on that, Ben? Because a concern I would have, and I used to work for food manufacturers and bread and milk, is that consumers get confused very easily, and if they see best if used by or used by, they may not know the difference, and many of them don't go
Right,
to a
it's not
website
perfect.
because it's easier to pick up a
Data.
phone, especially for those who might be older. And they're the ones who, to be honest, I would be most concerned about because they have often compromised immune systems. So I'm just wondering how, and I understand the logic of
Yeah.
it, but I think it's just very easy for consumers, they sound almost the same. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so why don't we take those 2 questions,
Yeah,
and
we
then
can
we're
do
gonna have to call it a wrap here.
I can very quickly kind
Let's
of
do that,
tackle
yeah.
that one, which was just, again,
Yeah.
I think there were a couple things going on at once. So GMA and FMI together collected some data. They tested out some terms. We also had done a survey that Dana mentioned with Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future and National Consumer League. And what we found was best if used by, which actually I will say, neither of these are the terms I personally would have selected. But best if used by far beat out all the other terms on people thinking that it meant quality. It was like more than 70%, and everything else was closer to the middle. And then as far as the 2 terms that the most commonly were associated with safety, expires on was 54%, used by was 42%. Expires on, so I would, based on that, go with that. I think for a bunch of reasons, there was some pushback on using that. So I think, again, we did use some data. FMI, GMA tested a few different pairings, and so there's data to back this up. Yeah, but it's not perfect.
And then
Same,
can one
I
of you
agree.
take on, sorry, my questioning my system didn't work quite out, but can we get back to her question?
yeah. Go.
Yeah, I'll start and you can jump in. I was gonna say, just as anecdotally a story, I was walking through a food bank and they had a poster in the back describing what to do with products and days. It was the most complicated description, by product, how many days can you keep it, how many days, based on the temperature, it was super complex. So as we talk about consumer education, which is a question over here, I think that's actually a huge consumer base also to be educating, and how can we be helping them. The standardization, and you asked the benefits of federal legislation that standardizes, I think one of those is it will greatly simplify for those audiences and food donations, how to streamline the process and the flow of goods through a food bank, for example. So there is a lot of challenges. We hear them tell us that there are challenges on managing products, and there is not a standard way that they are dealing with that across all food banks. It's very much food bank by food bank.
And I'll also add that, having worked kind of alongside a lot of food agencies that are distributing food, I've consistently heard from them, like, can you please tell our clients about this? Because our clients get expired food and think it's bad. And so, you know, or feel like they're getting something that's bad, right? So that there's kind of this whole other component where, and just because you're poor doesn't mean you want to get your kids sick with food, right? And if that's what the food's going to do in their mind, they're not going to use it. So it's affecting kind of across
The
the
last
board.
part I was going to mention on this, really on behalf of the food banks, is, you know, we have Good Samaritan laws in place. We continue to strengthen those. Feeding America really has led on that. Thank you guys for the great work. And still, there's a ton of hesitancy by donators. So that's a whole other side of this discussion we haven't really talked about, is getting past those barriers and helping people understand that they have protection in place for safe food that they are able to donate. And
Yeah,
and
even if it's
we're
after the
losing a
date.
ton.
Yeah.
And just to give a shout out to Mitzi, who's over
Yeah,
here, is
we keep
food
pointing at her.
safety for Feeding America, and I think was definitely a really helpful resource for us in working on the dating game, and just understanding from the food bank perspective that there is a lot of challenge as well with these state laws and with confusion. And so I don't want to put you on the spot, but if people have questions on
Raise
that
your hand,
in
Mitzi.
particular, maybe people can come chat with you too. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. A lot more discussion to
I
be
know.
had, but we
Come
are
to our date
over
local
our
working group
time,
tomorrow.
so-
Yes, okay, thank you.